One of the things I've learned about architecture by studying sculpture is something about how Peter Eisenman was able to so eloquently dismantle the metaphysics of presence. He became the product of both an American and a French contemporary culture that started coming together around sculpture in New York in the early 1960s. Then, what was believed to be fun and exhilarating was poking fun at romantic and modernist conceptions of art and the artist. The deep and meaningful school of art was up for parody, and one of the best examples came from Andy Warhol's interviews with their laconic refusal of meaning. Quote, "If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me, and there I am. There's nothing behind it," unquote. Warhol's response to his interviewer was to open up a post-humanist paradox of the self and its disjunction either from the body or from the physical world. And by 1963, a similar note of depersonalization soon arose in the work and writings of minimalist sculptors such as Donald Judd, Robert Smithson, Saul LeWitt, Carl Andre, and Robert Morris. Now, another point in this move came from France in March 1962 with Alain Robbe-Grillet's Last Year at Marienbad. Set in a sumptuous Baroque hotel, the scenes follow the male protagonist as he attempts to convince the female protagonist they had an affair the year before. She claims no memory of the affair, and it is not clear whether he is correct, mad, mistaken, confused, or a manipulative seducer, because there is no inner dialogue and no final authoring of the story. This film was not a typical 1950s Hollywood romance. It played mental reality against physical, corporeal reality, and seemed to sever the link between the subject and the enjoyment of its body. After the movie is finished, the audience must assemble the scenes into significance and take responsibility for their narrative. This kind of cinema aimed to reveal the character of the spectator of the film, not the character of the protagonists in the film. And it was worth watching several times to see what, in the film's many ambient scenes and structures, produced one's assumptions, projections, and conclusions. As the camera lingers on the Baroque architecture with its dynamic metaphysics of presence, we could indeed wonder what roots are laid out here to Eisenman's architecture. My point here is that for the budding minimalists who watched this film, such as Judd, Smithson, and LeWitt, there was a way to read it as a double paradox of what it meant to be a self in relation to the drives. To take a somewhat Lacanian view, the female protagonist is caught more in a disjunction between the mind and the body, like LeWitt and Morris will be. The male protagonist is caught more in a disjunction between the mind and the world, more like Smithson and Judd will be. There is a difference, then, in where the drive is located. And this will be important because the future of deconstruction in architecture will, in a sense, depend on which of these minimalists Eisenman will identify with. Now, in the New York of 1964, Robbe-Grillet's novel and his essay, A Future for the Novel, were available to Judd, Smithson, and LeWitt. The essay in particular forcefully argued that the purpose of most traditional literature was to reinforce the humanist myth that man and nature had a depth of significance. The classical novel created, quote, a certain anthropomorphic atmosphere, vague but imbuing all things, giving the world its so-called signification, that is, investing it from within by a more or less disingenuous network of sentiments and thoughts. In a new novel, however, quote, on the contrary, objects will gradually lose their instability and their secrets, will renounce their pseudo-mystery, that suspect interiority which Roland Barthes has called the romantic heart of things. No longer will objects be merely the vague reflection of the hero's vague soul, the image of his torment, the shadow of his desires, unquote. In effect, A Future for the Novel advocated a complete rejection of the humanist tradition, including the American avant-garde of Jackson Pollock and Mies van der Rohe. In 1964, this argument against humanist anthropomorphic projection came into American minimalism firstly through the highly descriptive art criticism of Donald Judd, who quietly adhered to Robbe-Grillet's views on the absolute separateness of self and world. By 1965, Judd's art criticism, like his sculpture, suppressed metaphor and avoided romantic notions of interiority. Unlike the abstract expressionists before him, who talked about sincere inner feelings, Judd was for depersonalization and, quote, subverting the idea of the natural presence of human qualities in all things, unquote. Judd's minimalism was about the reduction of metaphor rather than the reduction of form. And Judd would stop here. But for some minimalists like Lewitt, André, and Smithson, Robbe-Grillet opened the way to structuralism. And in 1965, some of this was supported by Annette Michelson, later a co-founder of the journal October. And in the academic world, it was the October 1966 Structuralism Conference in Baltimore and its subsequent publications. Now, in 1967, the first outcome of this turn to structuralism in sculpture was the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport project, in which Smithson, with the help of Morris, Lewitt, and André, took on one of the biggest contemporary civil engineering projects in the country as consultants to the architects Tibbets, Appett, McCarthy, Stratton. What was fun, exhilarating, and liberating for the minimalists in this project was dismantling the different language units of sculpture, architecture, and landscape. The project drew heavily on Barthes' The Structuralist Activity, 1967. And here, the structuralist wasn't interested in meaning as much as in how they were fabricated by units of language. By dismantling an object, novel, or philosophy, it was possible to see how meanings that appeared natural were, in the end, a structure of physical signifiers and mental signifieds combined into simulation. As Barthes famously remarked in this essay, structure is therefore actually a simulacrum of the object. Now, Smithson's essay on this project picked out the units or modules of surveyors' maps and their cartographic language of dots, lines, triangulations, and grids. He compared this language to geological crystal structures and to the panel and space frame architectural systems made from standardized triangular modules and connections, as if maps, crystals, and architecture all demonstrated Barthes' point that language is a network of units. In his proposals, Smithson worked with geometric rules of structure in mind and matter, and like early Barthes, was struck by how the same ideas that structured thought also structured the physical geological world. For Smithson, quote, words and rocks contain a language that follows a syntax of splits and ruptures, unquote. On the other hand, Saul Lewitt, in his contribution to this project, thought there was a danger, quote, in making the physicality of the materials so important that it becomes the idea of the work, unquote. He chose the cube not just because it was conceptually understood, but because of its calming effects on the body. Quote, compared to any other three-dimensional form, the cube lacks any aggressive force, implies no motion, and is least emotive, unquote. By 1967, the minimalists were interested in language rather than in form, and so Smithson, André, Morris, and Lewitt organized the Dwan Gallery Language Shows. In keeping with Barthes, the structuralist activity, Smithson set two groups in the exhibition. One showed how much simulacrum there was in mankind's representations of nature. The other group showed how much physical nature there was in human simulacra. What operated here was a belief that individual and group instincts were transformed when structured by language, and that produced a paradox in the location of the drive. Now, this language show marked the beginnings of conceptual art through Saul Lewitt, but it wasn't before Barthes' publication of The Death of the Author. It appeared in the remarkable multimedia minimalism issue of Aspen magazine. For many in the American art world, this was their first exposure to Roland Barthes, who had moved on at this point to propose the end of authorial presence in favor of what he called multiple writing. Quote, a space of many dimensions, in which are wedded and contested various kinds of writing, no one of which is original. The text is a tissue of citations, resulting from the 1,001 sources of culture, unquote. Smithson and Lewitt were among the few artists prepared enough to keep up with either Barthes' structuralist or post-structuralist work. Smithson's essay, A Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, took a non-trip into the hinterlands of New York, courtesy of a tissue of citations from Homer, Nabokov, and Borges. The tour eventually leads to an innocent-seeming public monument, a child's sandbox, that confounds all attempts at metaphor or meaning-making. All there is an insistent, repetitious fixation on a signifier. Language seeks to cover as much as it does discover. Language meets its limits in representing the world, for sure, yet at the same time, language and the minds that make it are themselves also real structures in a material sense. Now, by 1968, Lewitt's structuralism was evident in his paragraphs on conceptual art and its trouncing of humanist expectations of art, saying that, quote, "The logic of a piece or series of pieces is a device that is used at times only to be ruined. Logic may be used to camouflage the real intent of the artist, to lull the viewer into the belief that he understands the work, or to infer a paradoxical situation," unquote. Lewitt liked, quote, "a work that uses the idea of error, a work that uses the idea of infinity, a work that is subversive, a work that is not original," unquote. In 1968, Lewitt was working on his logical variations, the dematerialization of sculpture into written concept, and his own version of the death of the author. Here, subjectivity was split between mental and corporeal, rational and irrational, leading critics like Dan Graham and Rosalind Krauss to a reading of his work more in terms of the mind-body paradox. Now, Lewitt and Smithson had a philosophical structuralist interest in language-like properties of sculpture and architecture, and a taste for exposing the drives in language through subversive extremes of obfuscation and infinity. One of them enjoyed the paradox of the self as a disjunction between mind and matter. The other enjoyed the paradox of mind and body. Both sculptors found the fixation of the drives at work in language, giving it its seemingly independent force. In conclusion, it was the sculptor's enjoyment of structuralism that was passed on to Peter Eisenman as he arrived at the party. The link was through the art critic Rosalind Krauss, who knew the minimalists. She dated Robert Morris and met Eisenman in 1969. Her preference for the mind-body paradox informed Eisenman's interests, including his reading of David Smith's Cubist sculpture and Robert Morris's phenomenological sculpture, for their joint disjunction of perceptual and conceptual space. By 1970, Saul Lewitt became Eisenman's major source in his own search for a conceptual architecture that could define a non-homogeneous subjectivity in terms of the mind-body paradox. As Desley Luscombe has pointed out, a House 6 drawing defines what it meant to be a self as a disjunction between the experience of the conceptual objects and spaces of the mind and the phenomena experienced by the body. Eisenman's house drawings, or his Berlin Holocaust monument, are meant to disjoin the relationship between experience and understanding to produce experience without meaning. He claimed it located a universal disjunction, common to all and binding. So what I've learned about architecture by studying sculpture is that Eisenman's Holocaust monument, like Smithson's sandbox in the monuments of Passaic, ponder the causal force of history in very similar and distinctly structuralist ways. Be it mind and body or mind and matter, for Lacan, what is at the bottom of this disjunction is the drive, experienced as meaningless. It just is, in its insistent repetitious fixation on a signifier. Eisenman, in his language drawings, finds the drive mostly in the body, not in the world. Landscape here is excluded as an invisible real. This is because Eisenman missed Smithson, and in missing Smithson, Eisenman missed out on the minimalist with the most rigorous grasp of Barthes, and also one who could use it to chart a course from postmodern language philosophy to today's concerns for the land, environment, and material sustainability. In missing Smithson for Lewitt, Eisenman would be pleased by a deconstructivist architecture, but not one that enjoyed the structuralist paradox of language as part of the physical environment. Because Smithson died in 1973 in a plane crash, he was not there to read Eisenman's house drawings as a death of authorial presence in the face of cuboid salt crystals, nor to note the syntax of splits and ruptures in his drawings, nor to discuss the drives as a paradox of mind and matter, not just mind and body. Thank you.